in states are running into serious problems.
Morning, Gail.
Morning, Sam. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
You like my background?
Oh, that is
Western
fantastic.
Louisiana.
Do I actually recall you're taking that picture?
No, that actually Amy Drought took that.
Amy did. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, it's 9 o'clock. Let's start. Sam, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Good morning, and good afternoon to the colleague from Europe, and good evening to our Asian colleagues. And so today, again, welcome you again to this World River Delta System, Source to Sink webinar series. And today we invite Professor Sam Bentley from Louisiana State University give a talk about a story about Mississippi River source to sink, all the way from tectonic, climatic, and anthropogenic influence. So before I introduce Sam, I will say next week, and we have two related Mississippi River talks. We kind of put them lined up together. So Kevin Xu, also from Louisiana State University, he will also talk about the particularly focus on the sink part. Today, I think Sam talked a lot about the source, the basin, the river evolution. But Kevin, I believe he may be mainly focused on the sediment dispersal on the shelf. And also Friday, Courtney Harris from Virginia Institute of Marine Science, she will talk about numerical modeling to understand the large river system. As you can see here, the Pearl River system, Mississippi River, and the Irrawaddy River system. So in the past talk, we don't have too many numerical modeling work. That's something we definitely need. So please do come back next Wednesday and Friday the same time. So Sam, Professor Sam is a professor now at Louisiana State University, the Department of Geology and Geophysics. And also I'll point out he's currently the Vice President for Research and Economic Development. And he also hold a Harrison Chair in Sedimentary Geology and also associated with the Louisiana State University Coastal Study Institute. He earned his PhD back to 1998 from Stony Brook. I believe you're working with Chuck, right? Chuck Nitrover.
Yep.
And then he had some faculty position in Canada, Newfoundland sometime. And he has been studying the Muddy Delta continental shelf modeling since the 1985. Gosh, like the ancient history. His field study, covered all the way from high latitude Canadian Arctic, Oceania, and also focused on now mainly Mississippi River Delta since 1998. So I think now I give the floor to Sam. Sam, now you can share your screen and put it to the presentation mode.
Okay, great. Let's see, share. Does that look right, Paul?
Yes, it's good.
Okay. Great. Hey, listen, thank you everyone very much for joining us. Today I'm going to work through a lengthy paper that Mike Bloom, Jillian Maloney, and I wrote with a lot of graphic and data analysis support from Lisa Pond and Robert Paul Sell from the Louisiana Geological Survey back in 2016. So this is work that's been done over many, many decades by a lot of people. So I want to start out with a little bit of sort of overview. So I think everybody recognizes that the Mississippi River is a major global source to sink system. Like most systems, fluvial marine systems, it's under a range of environmental threats that are driven by human activities. It's been under study for over 200 years. And one of the points I want to make is there's still a lot of uncertainties, particularly with the certainty that we require for predicting future environmental responses. We could spend a whole semester talking about restoration and environmental threats. And today I'm mostly going to focus on fundamental morphodynamics of the system. A little bit of background. Like I said, the system has been studied a lot for a long time by a lot of people. And James Buchanan Eads was one of the leading engineers of the 19th century. He did a lot of amazing things, including designing the jetty system at South Pass, which is a design that's now used for the other outlets of the river. But he was giving a lecture to the St. Louis Merchants Exchange in 1878, and he said this. He said, "We see that the Creator has, in his mysterious wisdom, endowed the grand old river with almost sentient faculties for its preservation. By these, it's able to change, alter, or abandon its previous devious channels, elevate or lower its surface slopes, and so temper the force which impels its floods to the sea." Now, to me, that sounds like a very beautiful poetic description of autogenic tendencies within a river, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. Now, another thing that I mentioned is anthropogenic threats to the river. This too has been around a long time and has been understood for a very long time. Elmer Cortell was another major 19th century engineer, and he wrote an article in this December issue of the 1987 volume of the National Geographic magazine. And here's something that he wrote in that magazine. "No doubt the great benefit," oh, let me back up. At this time, the major flood control structures had already been in place, and major levees and cutoffs had already been in place along the Mississippi River. So he was talking about that year. "No doubt the great benefit of the present and 2 or 3 following generations accruing from a complete system of absolutely protective levees, excluding the floodwaters entirely from the great areas of the lower Delta country, far outweighs the disadvantages to future generations from the subsidence of Gulf Delta lands below the level of the sea and their gradual abandonment to this cause." My emphasis. So what this tells us is in over 120 years ago, they understood the basic morphodynamics of how deltas evolved, and they understood that putting in the flood control systems at that time would cause the levee to disappear, but it was worth it to protect the present generation at that time from flooding. So again, these environmental threats have been understood for a long time, and they've been choices that we've made. Another great read, if you want to delve in, if you really want to see people who knew what they were talking about, is this issue, the 1936 LGS Bulletin number 8. This is the first comprehensive study of the lower Mississippi Delta, and it really lays out the dynamic characteristics of the Delta that we now know. If these guys had had radioisotope geochronology at the time, they would have been able to wrap it all up in a few decades. Okay, so what are we going to talk about for the next little bit? We're going to talk about S2S processes and products over a range of spatial scales. I'm going to try to touch on some high points going all the way from Neogene to Anthropocene timeframes, touching on continental all the way down to local phenomena. And we're going to be looking at climate, tectonics, and anthropogenic forcing, and also discussing whether phenomena are autogenic or allogenic. And one question that I'm not going to answer, but I want you to think about is, do we know enough now to predict river response to future conditions in sufficient detail for planning and assessing risk to human populations? So all of the figures and everything that I've shown you, except for the last 2 slides, are in this link to the article that I'm showing you now. All right, so going back to the sort of before the beginning of what we think of as the Mississippi River system, going back to the Cretaceous, North America was a very different river system place in terms of river sediment dispersal at that time. So we had, according to Mike Bloom's work, we had a major system that mostly fed into the Arctic during the late Cretaceous. And by the time we got into Paleocene time, the systems had rerouted so that we had sort of a balanced flow of northward into the Hudson Bay and southward into the Gulf of Mexico by Paleocene time. moving up into the Oligocene, we had the sort of the origins of a major Mississippi River drainage network, but most of the sediment delivery was focused in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico, coming out of the areas that now we consider the Rio Grande and the rivers of southwest Texas and northeastern Mexico. So there wasn't really anything we recognize as a Mississippi. This blue line right here is just a modern cartography. But the sources were there, the Rocky Mountain Orogenic Plateau and the Appalachians. Now we move up into the Myocene, and this is what I consider, and a number of people consider, to be the origins of the modern Mississippi system, with an axis coming straight down the center of the North American continent and an sediment apron in the northern Gulf of Mexico. The phenomena that caused this shift from west to east into the central North American continent included a tectonic subsidence in the Rockies, along with drying out of climate in the Rockies, that caused the sediment production to be largely captured by fans, by large aprons of sediment on what are now the high plains. The Appalachians were largely dormant as a sediment source, but going into the late Miocene, increase in precipitation reactivated erosion and caused and accelerated sediment delivery from the eastern North America into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this diagram shows what would be an ancestral Tennessee River and an ancestral Mississippi River. We actually don't know that. What we do know is that over millions of years of time, the Tennessee and the Mississippi and their tributaries have merged and diverged over time. So this is representative of a potential, but not necessarily a reality at the time. And at this time, the foundations of the Mississippi fan and the Gulf of Mexico abyssal plain began to form. Coming into the Pleistocene time, this is when climate began to take precedence. So shown here from about 600 to 100,000 years ago, North American ice sheet was a dominant feature that waxed and waned over time, and associated sea level cycles and deglacial floods drove the scouring of the alluvial valley, drove the scouring of deep sea canyons that cut across the continental margin, and the building of the deep sea fan. And we'll talk more about this over the next few minutes. And one thing I'd like to point out that's sort of unique about the Mississippi River system is seismic studies have shown that there are at least 13 buried canyon systems underneath the northern Gulf of Mexico continental margin that are caused by the ancestral Mississippi River. Many river systems of a similar age have one or maybe two canyon systems, and this is probably caused in part by the combination of deglacial flooding happening over many, many times, and also salt motions in the subsurface with the motion of salt tectonic motions of Cretaceous age salt that sort of moves around underneath the continental slope. So this is the diagram from some of Galloway's work, and the previous slides were adapted from several Galloway papers, showing that in the Miocene, at the time that the Mississippi, as we kind of know it, became established, sediment supply was relatively low, but then accelerated into the Pliocene and even more so into the Pleistocene to really create the fan that we're going to talk about over in some of the next slides. So we have on the top a diagram that shows Delta 018 patterns over about the last 600,000 years. And also, if we look at these colored bars under Weimer and Bauma, these are the names and ages of seismic sequences that Weimer and Bauma identified in seismic studies that I'm going to show you in upcoming slides. So the Bauma data and the Weimer data mostly extend from marine isotope stage 11 up to the present. Now, we have the most information on the last full glacial cycle. So from marine isotope stage 5 to the present, this really created sort of the modern landscape and the modern seascape. And marine isotope stage 5 characteristics in the northern Gulf of Mexico margin were probably similar to the modern characteristics, but sea level was a little bit higher at that time. So we have a much better idea of both terrestrial and marine processes that were happening. And some of this is because there are some unique sediment deposits in the Gulf of Mexico that preserve high resolution records, like within the Orca Basin, which is a salt basin on the Mississippi fan slope. So what we know is that there were multiple fans that were active at different times. Bryant fan, fed by Bryant Canyon, and the Eastern fan, which then became dormant. And then the main fan was active throughout much of this period. During marine isotope stage 5, there were meander belts active in the alluvial valley, slackwater deposits that occur at different locations along the continental margin. And then as sea level falls, braid belts, wide braided river successions began to develop through the valley. Then sea level, and throughout this time, we also see records of large plume deposits from large river floods that are deposited out along the continental margin in the deep ocean. Braid belts continue right up until about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. We see a large number of large large flood deposits in the marine basin. And again, meandering river system resumed from braided river system about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. Now, interestingly, LSU is lucky enough to have two ceremonial Indian mounds on our campus, right on the campus, that had never been dated before a couple of years ago. And the folks who are working on that have just recently dated the earliest ceremonial activity to about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. And the mounds look out over what would have been an estuary 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. So the genesis of the estuary and the delta of the Mississippi River appear to be associated with the construction of the earliest human structure, certainly in North America and possibly in the world, going in the earliest Holocene time. It's a really cool story there. So these are images showing structure maps with insets shown here in the lower left-hand corners of late Pleistocene fan reflectors that are more or less correspond to high stand condensed suction deposits. Now, you can't see too much in these figures, but these are the structure maps that we use to create these isopachs of fan lobes of different ages. So the top left-hand corner is roughly the last sediment deposits from the last low stand. And then the previous low stand, previous, going back to about MIS, marine isotope stage 11. And what you can see here is that over time, these lobes of deep sea sediment evolve, and you get avulsions and thalweg migrations in the fan that are kind of like what you see in terrestrial river-dominated deltas, like we're going to see in the Mississippi River. So some example of autogenic characteristics in these deep sea fans over timescales that are tens of thousands of years, much longer than we see for the delta cycles in the subaerial delta plain. Now, in addition to structure maps that we got from Bauma's data, we also have channel distribution networks from data collected by Weimer. And again, here going from channel system 17 up to channel system 14 to the youngest, channel system 17. These represent low stand channel delivery systems that are stacked on top of each other within the Mississippi fan. And the youngest one, this pale blue right here, actually is on the seabed surface, and you can see meandering characteristics in that, which are because we can actually see it with deep sea side scan data. So we see multiple canyons, multiple fans, and stacked lobes and channel systems within the deep sea that are responding, where sediment delivery is driven by climatic forcing on the continent, but within the fan itself, it appears to have autogenic tendencies. So this is the table. I don't want you to look at the details in the table too much, but these are the high points. So the sediment burial rates during low stands were similar to or slightly higher than the entire discharge of the Mississippi River before dams were built. And the deep sea fan is the primary depot center during the Pleistocene. So the terrestrial record is mostly lost, except for, you know, sort of thin veneers. Again, this is another complicated table. I don't want you to focus on the table, but the take-home message from this is that Paul Aaron in the early 2000s was able to reconstruct the scale of massive deglacial floods by looking at the delta 018 isotope concentrations in seawater for different flood periods. And what he learned from a detailed chronology and detailed isotope analysis is these floods lasted decades to hundreds of years, and the average flow rate was 2 to 3 times the largest modern floods, which suggests to us that the largest flow rates must have been truly gigantic for these deglacial flood events, perfectly capable of doing major scouring, major sculpting of the margin. Now, getting into the Holocene, most everyone has heard the story about the lobate construction of the Mississippi River Delta. What we've done here is we've gone back to the original data of Fisk and others and added the distributary networks that were active at the time for the different lobes. So on the, we can see here on the top left side, at about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, we have the beginnings of the Maranguin Delta lobe. And then the Teche lobe began to form a little bit farther to the east, followed by the St. Bernard lobe, which moved far off to the east and created sort of an opening here in the middle, which was filled in by the Lafourche Delta lobe beginning about 2,000 years ago and ending about 500 to 700 years ago. Now, interestingly, this Lafourche Delta lobe was this part of the delta that was active when European explorers came into the Gulf of Mexico. So they saw the transition from the Lafourche lobe to what we now see as the Plaquemines Bayou Delta lobe, the modern bird split. So it would have been a very different system at the time with many distributaries and a very permeable, wet coastline, very different from the modern system. And in the modern system, we have 2 primary channel systems that deliver sediment and water to the coast. The Chafalaya, which is a major distributary, and then the trunk channel of the Mississippi, which are bound by these levee flood control networks that have been built over about the last 100 years. And the time scale for these delta cycles, for these avulsions and lobe switching events, is about 1 to 2,000 years. So this is a diagram on the horizontal axis that shows time in thousands of years from the present back to about 10,000 years ago. And this summarizes a lot of information from a lot of sources. The bottom line is here for the lower 2/3 part of this diagram is that we have multiple delta lobes and multiple chronologies that have been proposed by different researchers, but they all tell a similar story of the time scale of the timing that I just showed you. In my opinion, probably the most reliable chronology that's been developed to date is done by the group led by Tor Tornquist and others. Since the paper was published, they've come out with some more dates, but they're using luminescence technologies to get dates out of sediment that were previously really unobtainable. It's very exciting. They're getting the the most detailed chronologies that are available at present time. But still, the basic history of the individual lobes remains the same. Now, one other aspect that I'd like to point out is these lobes have largely been attributed to autogenic tendencies within the river, avulsions driven by reduction in accommodation space and extension of channels to become inefficient with respect to gravity. And but we also see that there are large droughts. There are strong flood pulses that are documented in the Gulf of Mexico, other flood pulses and other sediment depot centers in the Gulf of Mexico. And so in short, there's circumstantial evidence that does link avulsions with climatic events such as floods and also the lack of avulsions with probably great droughts in the drainage systems over the course of thousands of years. So it's worth investigating the circumstantial relationship between allogenic and autogenic processes here. So the channel, the morphology of the river itself changes depending on where you are in the system. So this is some work from Mike Bloom's group. And the basic message here, going from upstream, downstream, is that the upstream portions of the river have much larger meander belts. The channels are thicker, the channels are wider. And once we get downstream close to the backwater location, back to the sort of the nick point or the avulsion node near the mouth, the connection with the Atchafalaya River, the channel belts get narrower and the channel belt thicknesses get less, and the meanders migrate less rapidly. So it's sort of controlled by where you are. And I also like to point out that the stage changes in the upper portions of the river are truly enormous. We get like 15-meter swings from one season to the other in the stages of the river. So it's really a lot of power there. As we go farther down the river, we also see that there are autogenic tendencies at more local scales, similar to what we saw on the full delta scale with the delta lobes. If we look at the bird's foot, we see that the bird's foot delta is actually comprised of subdeltas that have spatial scales of maybe several hundred square kilometers and evolve over 1 to 2 centuries. And so the entire bird's foot is actually comprised of multiple lobes that have formed at different times and are aging over time and responding differently because of their age with respect to growth or decline. And this work was initiated by Coleman and Gagliano and others back in the 1950s and 60s, but there's still some really cool stuff going on by, led by Alex Kolker and others. So here's an example of one of Coleman's studies from about 30 or 40 years ago. The West Bay subdelta of the Mississippi River in 1845 was open water. It began to fill in 1875 with a rapid growth up to about 1900. At that point, sediment supply became reduced because of declining channel efficiency, and consolidation of the sediments began to take over. And so the area of the West Bay subdelta began to decline. And this is characteristic of pretty much of most of the subdelta lobes within the lower river. Going farther offshore, we see that the bathymetry and the morphology of the subaqueous delta is shaped by gravity-driven sediment flows. This is the style of a block diagram that dates from Coleman's 1980 report, but it's actually got actual bathymetry from one of J.P. Walsh's data sets. And we've drawn in the morphology to indicate gullies, mud flow lobes, pressure ridges, and collapse depressions that occur in the upper portion. So it's a very irregular, gravity-driven system within the subaqueous delta. So overall, looking at sediment storage and sediment capture, about 90% of the sediment storage is in the alluvial valley and delta plain, and a little bit in the bird's foot. So very different from the Pleistocene, when we have most of the sediment stored in the deep sea fan. Now, we're going to get into the Anthropocene for a few minutes now. And this is a figure that we've adapted from Mead's work. And what it shows is the water routing within the Mississippi River system. So we see that most of the water comes out of the east, the Ohio and the Tennessee rivers, and not too much water comes out of the Missouri. A little bit comes out of the upper Mississippi. And this is the sediment routing showing latest Holocene in the pale yellow, and then Anthropocene in the brown. So from about 1904 until about 1954, the Corps of Engineers in the United States built a series of earthen dams in the upper Missouri River Valley that effectively cut off the major sediment source for the Mississippi system from its source. And you can see the effects of that in this figure, going from sort of pre-dam construction to post-dam construction circa 1980, a reduction of the sediment supply by a factor of at least 2. And you can also see that a lot of the sediment comes out of the Atchafalaya, but most of the sediment, the majority, comes out of the Mississippi. So this shows the effects of the dam construction in terms of sediment loads over time. For the Mississippi River at Tarbert Landing, which is near Old River Control Structure, it's St. Louis, the Missouri River at Hermann, Missouri, and the Missouri River at Omaha. And the main story here is that dam construction took place before 1954. And also we have very little reliable data from sediment load prior to 1954. But what little data we do have suggests that sediment loads were at least twice as high then as they are now. And there's also been sort of a steady decline in sediment carried by the river from 1954 to 2010. The upper Missouri River contribution post 1955 is mostly from bed scour. So the river is actually carving out its own channel because there's no sediment coming from behind the dams, really, not much to speak of. So we've really cut the river off from its primary sediment source. Now, where does that sediment go? This is sort of a new presentation of data from Mead Allison et al. 2012, which show a couple of things. First of all, here's the Atchafalaya, here's the Mississippi River, and the sum of sort of the Melville, and these numbers represent the sediment load in millions of tons per year. So the sum of these two is approximately the total load carried by the river south of Tarbert Landing. And these annotations down here show the amount of sediment leaving the different outlets of the Mississippi River. So there's one major tributary and one trunk channel here, but the main Mississippi River, I'd like to point out, has many, many, many outlets for sediment other than the ones that most people think of, which are South Pass, Southwest Pass, South Pass, and Pass Elutra. So in the presence of these many outlets plays a big role in what's happening to how the system is evolving right now, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay, looking at this diagram, this figure shows water discharge in the lowermost river between New Orleans and pretty much the mouth of the river, the amount of water going down the channels. So looking at the top figure, AHP means above head of passes. So above sort of where the tributaries break up near the mouth of the river. Below head of BHP stands for below head of passes. And what we see is that the below head of pass water discharge is declining on average at about 0.5% per year. Whereas the above head of passes discharge out all of those little channel openings is increasing at a little bit less than 0.5% per year. So this means that we're losing stream power downstream and we're gaining stream power going out these little channels upstream, sort of south of New Orleans, but upstream from the river mouth. And the bottom panel is a more detailed look at it. What we see is above head of passes, again, an increase over time. And that is the sum of all of these small outlets that are added up together. South Pass is declining. This is one of the major outlets. And Pass Elutra is also declining. These are both actually pretty well silted up right now, both due to natural and anthropogenic causes. So the lower river main channel is losing stream power as you go downstream. This figure shows the rates of sediment infill in the main channel of the lowermost river. Again, this is from New Orleans down to West Bay near the mouth of the Mississippi River. And what we see is in this top figure that the riverbed was mostly erosional in the 1960s and the 1970s and 80s. And then it began to get depositional between the 1980s and the 2000s. And if we look at locations, so these are reaches, these are individual sections of the river going from near New Orleans down to near the mouth of the river. And as we go downstream, we see the fill rate, the amount of sediment that's piling up in the riverbed increases as we go downstream from about 1992 to 2004. So again, diminishing stream power, and there's an upstream migration off the depot center and the river channel. You can also see a lot of geomorphic changes in the subaerial extent of the Bird's Foot Delta itself. So this is where all those subdeltas are located. And in 1937, there was a tremendous amount of subaerial land, mostly wetlands, but still it was subaerial. And as we come forward to 2000, a radical decrease in the land area. So we've known for decades that the land area of the subaerial delta has been decreasing, but no one had taken a look at changes to the subaqueous delta. So we've started a project in 2013 to do that. I was the PI on the grant, but most of the geomorphic analysis was done by Jillian Maloney, who is now at San Diego State University as an assistant professor. And the bottom, Jillian looked at data that had initially been collected by Coleman and others, and which showed a historic progradation of the 10-meter isobath of all of the distributary outlets of the Mississippi River. And so 1764, 1838, 1867, 1898. So the rapid progradation of the Bird's Foot predated human intervention with the Mississippi River. But then it began to decelerate in the mid-20th century. And in fact, in all three of the major outlets of the river, the subaqueous delta marked by the 10-meter isobath shifted from prograding to retreating in about 1960. So just after the decline of the sediment transport carried in the river, driven by dam construction in the upper Missouri. If we go farther offshore, this is an analysis of bathymetric change that we did from 1940 to 1980. The red indicates piling up of sediment or a shallowing of the seafloor, and the blue indicates a deepening of the deepening of the seabed. So for the most part, areas close to shore in many locations are getting deeper, either by erosion, self-weight compaction, or both. And offshore, sediment, the seabed is grading, so there's sediment delivery to these locations, probably by gravity-driven flow. So a lot of changes offshore. The entire delta is not in retreat yet, but the inshore portions of it are. Now, if we look farther afield, many of you have heard of the Wax Lake Delta and the Atchafalaya Delta of the Atchafalaya River. And this is the newest section of the Mississippi Delta that's presently active and not very heavily controlled, except for the fact that we do control the amount of water that goes down the Atchafalaya River. Now, in this location, there's a delta forming in the bay, and a prodelta builds is associated with a mud stream that goes along this portion of the coast. And this coastline has been building as a function of coastal mud stream development for about 8,000 years. And it's fed by sediment from the delta when the river is discharging from the, discharging a lot of sediment from the western margins of the Mississippi Delta overall. It's not a huge portion of the Mississippi load, but geomorphically it's very important because it's part of the coastal system and it's in shallow water, and quite close to the coast. So looking at Anthropocene sediment fate over decadal timescales, this is put together using a bunch of different types of geochronology and different types of sediment loads. So it doesn't match up entirely in terms of a budget. But what we do see on the left-hand side, these are the sediment discharge values from the major outlets of the Mississippi River. Tarbert, the total river carried, total flow carried by the river, and above Hatta Passes, below Hatta Passes in the Mississippi, and the Atchafalaya Wax Lake discharge. What we see is that the floodplain and the channel are at present the biggest depot centers for sediment. The Bird's Foot Prodelta, or the proximal subaqueous portions of the delta, I would call them, along with the inshore shallow water prodelta of the Chafalaya Wax Lake system are the major depot centers, and very little is reaching the deep sea, and the Cheniere Plain and the Cheniere Plain coastline have a small amount of sediment accumulation. Okay, so to wrap things up, we created a diagram, sort of a log summary figure in the style of all of our friends, Jai Savitsky and John Millman, to sort of summarize the temporal and spatial scales over which the system evolves. So, this is pointing the wrong way. So tectonics and climate were the big drivers for the genesis of the modern fluvial axis over greater than million-year timescales. This is driven by subsidence in the Rocky Mountains, and also, this is a typo here, this should be aridity. So Rocky Mountain subsidence and aridity lowered sediment yield. A wet climate phase in the east increased sediment yield, and it created the modern Mississippi River axis. And while this was going on, salt deformation was occurring in the continental margin over time scales of thousands to millions of years. During the Pleistocene, climate is the dominant driver over time scales of thousands to tens of thousands of years. Alternating floodplain aggradation and nick point migration. The system was alternately aggrading and then evacuating sediment, extending up to 500 to 600 kilometers inland. And these long duration, really intense meltwater floods scoured the valley, built the fan, and built multiple canyon systems that were infilled by sediment later and also deformed by salt motion. So in terms of autogenic process response, we see that in the meander belt and in avulsion dynamics in the alluvial valley and the delta and in the deep sea fan, but over different time scales. Delta lobe cycles, subdelta cycles, and fan lobe sequences sort of span 100 to 10,000 year timescales. But there's also the possibility that there are allogenic triggers for some of these events. Major Holocene floods, major deep glacial floods, all may have been factors that triggered some of these phenomena that we often consider to be purely allogenic in origin. So the Holocene autogenic tendencies in the alluvial valley and the delta have been limited and restricted in the Anthropocene by river training, by the constructions of dams, by cutoffs, by levees. But still, the Mississippi is pushing against these engineered boundaries. It's trying to be autogenic, even in the face of human interference. So the examples of this include bed scour in the upper Mississippi River and Missouri River systems, where it's trying to adapt to new conditions of lowered sediment supply. The upstream migration of depot centers in the lowermost Mississippi. Essentially, the system is trying to backstep, even though it's hemmed in by levees, by all kinds of flood control structures, and we try to maintain it by dredging. So despite our best attempts, the Mississippi is still wiggling within its shackles and does still maintain some degree of autonomy. So I'd like to thank decades of students who have helped out with a lot of this work. It's been a great ride with everybody, going all the way from fluid muds to deep sea sediment cores. The folks in the Coastal Studies Institute, going back to before I was born, have been doing amazing work, and I'd like to thank them. And all the authors for all the papers that we stole from for this review. Thanks to all of you. And I'll be glad to answer any questions now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sam. So if you have any question, let me, you can unmute yourself, ask Sam directly.
So let's start with, I think Yuri might have been the first one. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the very interesting talk. Can you explain a little bit more about the low stand channels that you showed?
Oh yes, I didn't delve into that too much. If we were to go out and do if we'd been here 15,000 years ago, you're talking about the river channel, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. The channel that is indicated by the boundary between older Pleistocene sediments and Holocene sediments, which is just a couple of kilometers west of us, is scoured out to a very coarse braided channel fill at about 100 meters or so below the present land surface. And it gets deeper as you go farther south. And the evidence for scour associated with the sea level low stands extends at least 500 to 600 kilometers inland. So there is a very long wavelength for the response to the sea level low stands. And it's pretty closely coupled in time frame. So there was also a question, I think, from Kevin. Dr. Shu?
No, no question.
No question. Okay.
Thank
What
you.
else do we have?
Michael.
Yeah, I hadn't raised my hand yet, but see, yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there and a lot of similarities to things we see in the Ganges-Brahmaputra system, including that deep scouring. But one thing I want to go back to is your mid-Myocene pulse, because in the Baltimore Canyon, we also see a huge mid-Myocene pulse associated with the climatic transition. The sediment supply looks almost the same as your curve for the Mississippi. And you know, there I think it's that climatic change. It's not so much of a wettening, I think, as it's cooling and things are becoming more seasonal, and the seasonality is producing more erosion.
Yeah, Mike, I was definitely getting to the edge of my envelope of knowledge with that. But the cool thing that I got out of that is that those accelerations in sediment delivery at that time pretty much covered the entire Appalachian chain as far as I could see.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was that was remarkable. And at a time when elsewhere in North America, it was drying out more. So that was responsible for shifting, you know, the depot center or the delivery farther east.
Right, and I hadn't thought, but you know, certainly the existence of the Mississippi embayment shows that there wasn't a lot of sediment coming in. You had a giant embayment in the coastline there.
That's right. In the
more recently,
the shoreline, the Myocene shoreline is about probably 150 kilometers north of Baton Rouge. So it's well inland from where it is now. So, Tom Bianchi, I think I saw a question from you.
Yes, very nice talk, Sam. I really learned a lot about it. The one thing that it's a little off base from what you're talking about, but maybe you'll be able to reflect on this, is, you know, just thinking back at Peter Tayling's talk in terms of the activity of turbidites in transport from the inner coastal margin to the deep sea. You know, with this system, as you look at it from your perspective, in the Anthropocene, do you think we're seeing more turbidite transport to the deeper parts of the canyon? Is that something that's been looked at? I'm just trying to think of sort of this larger scale flow from my perspective of nearshore carbon that's being, you know, shunted to deeper areas. And I'm just wondering if you have any feel about that.
Well, two thoughts. First of all, in general, the upper slope is based on C14 geochronology that Harry Roberts and Jim Coleman did a number of years ago. The upper slope is fairly depleted from, you know, major sediment delivery. That being said, I think the best person to ask would be Courtney next week, because she and Savitsky and a number of other folks completed a study looking at the potential for turbidity current generation right now in the upper Mississippi Canyon. And from my limited knowledge of that, I would describe it more as leakage rather than a wholesale fire hose of mud going down the canyon at the present time. But it's there as a geohazard for sure. I'm not sure how much of a major source it is at the present time.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll make sure I see Courtney's talk.
Oh, Bill Mann made a comment in the sidebar notes about life in the Mississippi, because we did actually quote from Twain's Life in the Mississippi, but it was more in a humorous vein rather than in a rigorously geomorphic vein. So anyway, yes, we did incorporate Twain as well into the paper. Who's next?
Philip. Hey, Philip, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Is that me?
Yes.
Hey, Sam, nice talk. Thanks for having me.
Bill.
So one of your graphics showed that the discharge and I guess sediment flux as well was decreasing below the head of passes. And there was a corresponding shift of the 10-meter contra line. But there's also a corresponding increase in discharge above.
Correct.
Is there also a corresponding increase in the amount of sediment that's being discharged as might be manifest by the 10-meter contra line in those areas? Because the land area is going to decreasing like crazy, right?
We don't know. We tried to get funding for a major subaqueous delta study a couple of years ago from Bohm, and anyway, it didn't get funded. I'll just leave it at that. But I really don't know. I would guess that there is some tendency towards accumulation there, but I don't know. There's not a comprehensive data set that really shows inner shell for sort of shallow proximal prodelta accumulation or not.
Yeah, I find it's kind of intriguing though that there's been so much land loss in those areas despite the increase.
Well, the channels form jets that deliver sediment pretty effectively offshore, and it's the system is definitely it's in a stage of net loss, but I guess my point with those figures was not that we should expect to see land gain in the area near the areas where the sediment discharge is increasing, but that the Mississippi River system continues to evolve even though we tried to put shackles on it. And it is responding probably to sea level rise as well, even at fairly low rates of sea level rise. So that's another explanation for the upstream migration of outlets of discharge of sediment and water.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
Hey, Sam, you a great talk. In one of the slide, you show with Janine's work, the Subaqueous delta begin to, the shallow part begin to erode it, but then some little bit deposit in the little bit deeper portion. So,
right.
In other river system, as we communicated before, like for example, the Yangtze and even the Mekong also show the similar phenomena. That kind of Subaqueous delta begin to, instead of a rapid accumulation, but now begin to erode it. And so my question is, in Mississippi River, what is the threshold? What's the sediment supply to maintain that equilibrium that's instead of be eroded, but keep accumulation? Do you have an estimate about sediment load?
Yeah, well, it's somewhere between the present load coming down the Mississippi of about 120 to 140 million tons maybe per year, and the previous pre-dam load that would have been closer to 300 million.
Okay.
So, you know, we haven't actually done sort of a mass balance to establish that, but we have upper and lower boundaries on it.
Mm-hmm. That should be very interesting because like in the Yangtze after Three Gorges Dam, almost after 2003, we begin to see the bathymetry begin to become more negative. And so they will have pretty good correlation with the sediment reduction and the underwater morphology change. So here that's interesting. Okay, next question, Michael. Michael, you raise your hand?
Yeah, just needed to unmute. Yeah, so following up on Philip, so in the channels, you're beginning to see the sedimentation, and you showed what the volume of sediments was. How does the thickness of sediment compare to the relative sea level rise? Is this essentially, are the channels getting deeper, or is it that subsidence and sea level and the sediment is filling to keep pace?
Well, one of the reasons we know this is because dredging is now having to take place in areas where dredging previously didn't have to be completed to keep the channel open. So given if the Corps of Engineers stopped dredging the channel, it would fill in much more rapidly than it is right now. So it's shoaling at a rate faster than the rate of sea level rise.
Okay.
Probably because there's some kind of nonlinear relationship between flow deceleration and stream power. So even though the actual rise in sea level is not that great, the change in stream power is substantial associated with that. And we're seeing that kind of seeing a corresponding sediment deposition.
The channel is actually trying to shallow.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, Sam, can you see the question in the chat room?
Let me see.
Lost the one. From the
So Suniti is asking how damming has affected the suspended sediment's granulometry and the broader context of the sediment load. I don't know about the details of the total suspended load change down, upstream to downstream. There's two conflicting schools of thought on the effect on sand transport in the river. Some folks think that you can detect a change in the sand load in the river, which is during floods carried in suspension. Others have suggested that we're not going to see an effective change in the sand load carried by the river for a couple of hundred years. So, and my take on it is that there is a decrease in the amount of sand carried by the river, particularly in suspension. But as far as like looking at the frequency distribution, I don't know any information that would be able to show us that kind of shift.
Is there any other questions? Great talk, Sam. I hope you can also, because most of your slide is from published material. I hope if you mind, you can share your PowerPoint. Many students, community international scholar will benefit.
Sure, there's absolutely no problem there. Should I send you a PDF?
A PPT will be best if you can share with me, but yeah, you can find a way to share with me the PPT, but all the bottom line is the PDF. But anyway, so if any other question, I will do say next week, Kevin, from Louisiana State, as Sam mentioned, he will talk about the sediment dispersal on the shelf, and also Curtin Harris will slow the numerical modeling, help us understand the Pearl, Mississippi River and Irrawaddy River sediment transport. So the same time, Wednesday and Friday. Please mark your calendar and come back. So thank you very much. And if you know any other question, thank you, Sam. It's great. Also, this talk also available on the YouTube. So so if you want to rewatch and or forward to your student, you can do it. Okay.